Hi, I'm Judith Germain from the Maverick Paradox, and this is the Mavericks of Mass Creation, a series of unscripted conversations between myself and creativity activator David Chislett. We believe Mavericks and creativity combine to make an irresistible force for change that is sorely needed in a world that is developing faster than any time in history. So with these videos, it is our desire to share our knowledge about Maverick leadership and creativity with you to help make this world a better place. So in today's chat, we're talking about build a team. David.
Yes. Hello.
Well, build a team. What do you mean?
Well, yeah, I think what I mean is that a lot of people, when they start thinking about creativity, the kind of stereotypical image that springs into most people's head is the artist in his turret, yeah, locked away in isolation, beavering away to bring this work of earth-shattering importance out the door at some stage. And that's just absolute rubbish. There's a lovely little quote which says, "No man is an island separate unto itself." And, you know, creativity is not an island. It cannot actually exist in isolation. If you look into it, you'll find there's loads of stories of people who've retired to the country, locked themselves in a little hut somewhere in the middle of nowhere to focus on the novel or the painting. And
yeah,
it goes well for a while, and then it very abruptly crashes to a halt. Now, there has been some very interesting research done into how creativity works, and this notion of team and your environment, what's around you, is really become, what's the right word? Obvious as being critically important. So we can go all the way back to the 60s to Dr. Mel Rhodes to see the beginnings of this train of thought. Now, Mel Rhodes was on a mission to find the perfect definition of creativity. If you look online, you'll see loads, and a lot of them are quite contradictory, and some of them insist on stuff which, if you followed any of these conversations, you'll see quite clearly I don't believe in, and I think a lot of people who are creative don't believe in. And he failed. He was busy for 10 years, and so his conclusion was that you can't really define creativity because creativity isn't a one-dimensional concept. And it was Mel Rhodes who came up with the 4 Ps of creativity. And the 4 Ps are creative people, creative processes, creative products, and the creative press, which is your environment. And it's the environment which is the one that brings me to the thoughts of team, because your environment is anything that pushes in on you, that impacts you. I mean, we all know what it's like to be in the room with an energy vampire. With something that costs you way more energy than they give you. That's a classic example of who you do not want in your team when you're on the road to doing things. So open plan offices run afoul of this a lot. It's just putting you in a situation and your team in a situation where it's extremely difficult to stay in a creative mindset because of the physical characteristics of an open plan office. More recently, a young man by the name of Alan Gannett, I think I've referenced his book in these conversations before. It's called The Creative Curve. And through his researches into highly creative individuals from business and the art world, sports stars, you name it, was that they had something else in common with each other. And that was that they all had a community of individuals around them. And after time, Alan began to realize that he could break down those individuals into 4 distinct types. Number 1, the prominent promoter, the person who's in your team who goes out and then tells the world how wonderful you are. Number 2, the modern muse, your source of inspiration. So the muse was the Greek idea of these wonderful maidens reaching down from heaven and giving you inspiration. We can see a modern muse as more as being aligned with purpose, leading a purpose-led life, having a growth mindset. There's something in your life, in your world, that is what allows you to stand up after adversity has knocked you down, that fuels your resilience. The third interesting type is a conflicting collaborator.
Oh, I think I like that already.
Yeah. So, someone who just doesn't agree with absolutely everything you said, who is prepared to ask you the hard questions and make you justify what you're saying and why you're saying it and where you're going. I think the best example of this is the 20th century modern art movements, where you had people like Cézanne and Gauguin and Picasso, who, really fought like bloody dogs, and quite a lot of the time they weren't really friends because they were fighting so hard about the theories of what art should be doing and how we should be doing it. But without that conflict, they would not have been driven to do the category and the type of work that they did and to push the envelope as far as they did. It's because they had a large supply of conflicting collaborators, but they did work together and they supported each other and they pushed the whole thing forward. And then the last type that Alan Gannett has identified is the master teacher. Literally someone who's been around the block, who knows what's going on, is prepared to share the knowledge and inform you. I mean, these days that could just be your YouTube account, let's be honest. So the point is not so much that you have to have like Mr. Miyagi on your side or Yoda, but rather that you have to be committed to learning and be connected to a source of learning so that you're not standing still. And so if you can combine this thought of Alan Gannett's creative community, 4 distinct types, and how important environment is in this whole notion of creativity, you begin to see how really important it is to have a team.
I love that. That's really interesting. So do you have to have that team with you all the time? Do you need to be in a team of 5?
Sure. I think that's probably like the ideal world situation. I mean, do you really need a prominent promoter if you haven't really finished creating anything yet? And can you get a prominent promoter if you aren't creating anything yet? So I would imagine that it exists on a kind of continuum. But if I look at my life and my career as a creative individual, I've never become renowned in any way up until this point for being anything wonderfully special in any area that I did. And I noticed that I think for a large part that is due to the fact that I spent many years working in isolation. I didn't have any other creatives that I worked with. I most certainly did not have a prominent promoter. I have been a prominent promoter to many, many people, but I've never had someone batting for me in my corner in that kind of a way. Just hasn't happened. And it's only recently that I've kind of aligned myself with any kind of sense of purpose. So just to tell you the history of my guitar ownership, I think I've owned about 25 guitars because I would play and I'd be enthusiastic and then things wouldn't work out or things would go wrong or the band would break up or I would get frustrated and I'd sell it. And then I'd start again. And it's like, wow, that for me is like the physical metaphor of how important this idea of a creative community is and how lacking it was in my musical career.
That's really interesting. I'm trying to think if I have a community, and I think I do, but they are different people at different times. I guess I have those 4 people or personas, but they're not necessarily the same 4 people each time. Would that work? Does that still work?
I think so. I think, not to put words in Mr. Gannett's mouth, but my interpretation of it is that there is a specific function that needs to be fulfilled in the creative process, the creative life. And that if that function is not fulfilled by someone or something, you're going to experience lack. It's not quite going to work out the way you want. So if I'm right, if that interpretation holds, your prominent promoter could also be your conflicting collaborator. I mean, why not? Or your master teacher. As long as those functions are being fulfilled. And they're really important functions that need to be fulfilled because you need to be gathering data points all the time, hence the master teacher. You need to be constantly synthesizing thinking, stepping into complexity and ambiguity, hence the muse, the sense of purpose, and also the conflicting collaborator. And in terms of really ultimately keeping the big picture motivation going, wow, that prominent promoter, that person who's just clearing the road ahead for you a little bit, means that you can save your energy for the work instead of the work of the work, the getting it out there.
So that's really good and encouraging. But if you're an introvert, how do you build your team? You might not want to go out and find it.
Well, you see, I'm a bit confused these days as to whether I'm actually an introvert who's learned to be extroverted or actually just an extrovert. I've never had the team, and if most people who meet me would have assumed that I had the sort of extrovert skills to acquire it. So I'm not sure that it's kind of dependent on that. I think it's much like many other things, is that once you become aware that this can impact your ability to do what you want to do, that awareness will start to lead you on the path towards these people. I mean, I'd never thought of this idea that I should have a prominent promoter. Because I'd done so much promoting of other people, I just assumed, well, I just do that for myself. Now that I'm aware of it, I can totally see how that keeps on falling flat, and has historically always fallen flat. And therefore, I'm always now on the lookout for someone who's willing and interested to fulfill that role. Because I think people are, people get really motivated and inspired by creative people, and they want to share the ride. They want to see that, receive that kind of response from the world at large, not just from themselves. And people do remarkable things in the service of that. But if you're not looking for it, you may not notice that that's how someone's behaving, or you may be threatened by it, or feel insecure about it, or it may be overwhelming, and so you run away from it. So yeah, being an introvert on that level may be problematic with your prominent promoter, but it's also nice because it means that as an introvert, you don't need to learn how. They'll take care of that.
You know what? That's really interesting, because I made me think about the Maverick leader with the introvert. So with the creative, I should say, because the Maverick leader wants to feed the creative, because the creative becomes the Maverick leader's muse. So there's like a role. So, because I got to that thought process by thinking introverts build reputation through their expertise, maybe not promoting themselves, but their expertise stands out so much. Right. And then if they're found by a Maverick leader, they're like, wow, they're like my muse. They come up with this great innovation and stuff. So they'll constantly promote that person and feed that person, because it's a beneficial cycle.
It's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. So maybe creative needs to find some Maverick leaders, because they'll just, grab them and say, I'm never letting you go.
Well, I guess it's the trick is always to finding ways to let your expertise be seen.
Yeah.
And I think when you're an artist, that's probably easier than anything else. You put a song on the radio, you enter a competition, you get your art in the gallery. Well, I mean, not that any of those things are particularly easy to do, but there's an established pathway.
Yeah.
And if you're a highly creative individual in some other way, it's difficult. I had an interesting conversation with a woman yesterday who deals a lot with scientists. And my immediate reaction, and I should know better, was like, oh, also dry and overly intellectual. And she was like, no, these are the most creative people I've ever thought of.
Yeah, you would be, yeah.
Because they're constantly looking for ways to challenge our notion of what is real and right and correct, and how can we test it and prove it. And I mean, that requires an astonishing degree of creativity and an ability to step into ambiguity and look for the new. I mean, it fulfills all the criteria. And it's like, it's there in the job description, but it's not obvious to everybody from the outside. And I think sometimes as a high creative, that is the kind of the problem, as it were, is that the job title or the description is misleading because we have preconceptions about what that actually means.
That's true. So how does an introvert ensure that how does a creative ensure that their creativity isn't stifled by the conflicting collaborator? How do they not get intimidated?
Well, I think the second word is probably the most important one. I mean, it needs to be a collaborator, someone that you are working with, that you have a relationship with. There needs to be a degree of understanding. It can't just be, so a nasty newspaper critic is difficult to see as a conflicting collaborator. They're just a critic. They're just someone who's getting in the way. They're just being nasty, maybe justifiably, but it's always going to be hard for the recipient of that criticism to see it as conflicting collaboration. So I think there's there's a relationship difference that one needs to take into account here. And, people have fragile egos, and when you're being creative, by definition, you're stepping into an unsafe space, an indeterminate space, so you feel vulnerable. I think it really helps when your conflicting collaborator is also wading uncertain waters.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you.
Ooh.
Great. I think we'll stop there. That's a good place to stop. And that's such a fascinating conversation. My brain's going.
Good.
So thank you for that. That's really great. So thank you for watching and listening in, and we hope you found this useful and have had some tips to help you on your own creative journey. Please check out our show notes for all our links and sign up for our newsletters or social feeds to keep in touch. There'll be more Mavericks of mass creation in our next episode.